Hello, everyone. I'm Julia, and I will speak about the so-called New China rules and about how China uses a global propaganda campaign and strategic investment to further its interests on a global scale. Well, officially, China claims to support the established system of global governance, and indeed, China has benefited more than any other country from this international system, became an economic powerhouse thanks to open trade and international law. Yet China is doing everything it can to undermine the system. Nowadays, China increasingly expects the world to bend to its wishes, and it has adopted a set of behaviors to ensure it gets the outcome it wants. Oslan, the author of one of our readings, calls this set of behaviors the new China rules. And these new China rules are designed to enforce global compliance with Chinese wishes. So China aggressively steals intellectual property, be it from firms, governments, or individuals, doesn't really care about that. It spies on its so-called international partners. It uses widespread influence campaigns to target media, politicians, universities, and research institutes. And it works on an intense military buildup and an extension of the Chinese military presence in strategic regions. And it is also dedicated to promoting its economy by any means. Yeah, in the following, I will give a few examples that demonstrate how China does this. Let's start with the spying and stealing part. So we know that many countries have spies. It's nothing that China invented. But in China's case, spying and stealing is not a sideshow, but a key element of its geopolitics. China's economic growth was made possible by technological and industrial espionage. And for decades, the world was very willing to turn a blind eye to Chinese theft of intellectual property, hoping to gain access to the country's vast market. It is estimated that the intellectual property that China stole is worth billions or even trillions of dollars. Chinese hackers and traditional spies made this possible for China. But Chinese spying does not stop at consumer goods or trade secrets. China also steals personal data and copies military equipment. So a few examples here. In 2015, it was revealed that Chinese hackers stole from the US government the confidential personal information of more than 22 million Americans, many of whom held security clearances. Also, Chinese broke into insurance companies and stole information on another million or millions of Americans. The goal was to build massive databases to identify potential targets of blackmail. Basically, all successful Chinese companies have the approval of the Communist Party and can be potentially instrumentalized to deliver private information to the Chinese government. And even if we think of like harmless looking apps like TikTok, they all have a backdoor that can be exploited by the Chinese government. Yeah, China is also dominant in telecommunications worldwide. Huawei has become the world's largest telecom systems provider, which also raises fear of espionage operations. There is proof that Huawei helped to track down opponents of the government in authoritarian African countries. And also there are suspicions that Huawei is connected with Chinese intelligence services. And consequently, the US under Trump back then banned Huawei from participating in the building of the US's 5G networks. Canada, Japan, and New Zealand reacted similarly. However, many European countries did not ban Huawei. Let's continue with the military espionage. China's military has similarly benefited from Beijing's traditional and cyber espionage. The US Defense Department acknowledged that nearly every US military weapons development program had been infiltrated by Chinese hackers. And it's not a coincidence that many Chinese advanced fighters and drones look like copies of American versions. I will show you a little picture here. Yeah, so we see here the American F-22 Raptor and its little Chinese brother that looks very similar. And this means that US taxpayers are basically subsidizing the development of the Chinese military. And this extent of spying goes far beyond Russia's cyber influence campaigns that have been a little bit more present in the media. The FBI director in the US called Chinese espionage the most significant long-term threat that the country faces. Yeah, let's continue with China's global propaganda campaign. The Chinese Communist Party propaganda campaign has become a crucial element of its foreign policy. Xi Jinping pushed for a revitalization of communist thought in China, while he also demonized the West and its values. China uses this transboundary propaganda apparatus to silence any criticism of the country or its policies. And Western observers often tend to underestimate the importance of the ideological competition with the rest of the world for the Chinese Communist Party, but it's actually a very big thing for them. And Beijing takes advantage of the fact that foreign businesses and governments are willing to buckle on the Chinese demands so as not to lose their economic access when they take a critical stand. China is very aware of this fear, and of course, it takes advantage of that. China wants the West to change how it thinks and acts, and it also expects the West to engage in self-censorship and to punish the West's own workers for funding China. Basically, it wants the world to give up Western values and openly embrace China's worldview for continued access to its markets. Well, there are hundreds of examples of how China enforces compliance with its own worldview. To keep it short, I will only give you one single example. For example, the German car producer Daimler-Benz was forced to apologize in public to the Chinese people for having used a quote of the Dalai Lama in one of its ads. Note that the ad was not even run in China. Dalai Lama is, China is not very amused if Dalai Lama is mentioned, as Dalai Lama is regarded as a spokesperson for Free Tibet. He was forced into exile when China annexed Tibet. So, yeah. Another strategy that China uses to subordinate other countries is elite capture, which has become a growing concern. Elite capture is a crucial tool of China's geopolitical success. And by tempting another country's elites with money, access, and favors, China moves them to see their interests and China's interests as intertwined. Even within the European Union, we can observe this trend. European political elites have started to embrace Chinese rhetoric and interests, including where they contradict national or European interests. Greece, for example, refused to support EU condemnations of Chinese human rights abuses after major Chinese investments in the country. Let's continue with the cultural institutions. These are affected as well. There is a network of over 500 Confucius institutes on foreign university campuses and in major cities that are an important Chinese soft power tool. Also, Chinese embassies put pressure on museums or galleries that are intending to show art related to controversial topics such as, well, human rights abuses again, labor issues, environmental devastation, or military threat. Have you ever wondered why negative portrayals of China are almost entirely absent from Hollywood movies, in contrast to Nazis and Soviets that are not always presented in the nicest way? Well, this is because Chinese investors own major US entertainment companies, plus the Chinese box office provides a huge part of Hollywood's profits. Also, scholars and students play a role in this propaganda campaign. The Chinese government targets foreign scholars who expose China's interference abroad. In New Zealand, for example, an academic charged Beijing with a physical intimidation campaign designed to stop her from publishing evidence of secret Chinese actions in her country. Students also play a role. Recently, Chinese students flooded Western and particularly US universities, and China does not only monitor these students to ensure that they don't engage in anti-Chinese activities, but also mobilizes students to serve as pressure groups if needed. All of that threatens the academic freedom, of course, and government think tanks and universities worldwide have become used to treating China with extreme caution, and thus showing it a respect rarely granted to any other country. Yeah, so how now we explored a little bit how China tries to subordinate the world. Let's have a look at China's strategic investments. So here, a major initiative is the so-called One Belt, One Road, or the Belt and Road Initiative. This is a planned $1 trillion investment across Eurasia, through which Beijing seeks to reshape global trade and investment relations in nearly 150 countries. Belt and Road is designed to link land and sea-based trade routes, and it is planned to run from the east to the west, from the north to the south, with all routes being centered on China. Beijing's interests, however, go far beyond the trade element of the One Belt, One Road initiative. Instead, it is seen as a strategic policy to expand Chinese interests abroad, gain access to strategic ports, and use trade to foster military ties. And also keep in mind that also military equipment and troops can be deployed using trades. Another main motivation for the Belt and Road Initiative is China's rivalry with the US. The majority of Chinese international trade passes by sea through the Malacca Strait off the coast of Singapore, and we know that Singapore is a major US ally. With Belt and Road, China will create its own more secure trade routes and can maybe avoid this using the Malacca Strait. Yeah, and Belt and Road shall also make participating nations interdependent with the Chinese economy and thus increase China's economic and political influence. Yeah, so let's now focus on a few other strategic investments in different parts of the world. Yeah, China also massively purchases port and builds infrastructure. Critics sometimes claim that China uses debt trap diplomacy. In Djibouti, for example, China has combined development aid with building its first overseas military base. Very often, it is the case that countries that accept Chinese foreign aid realize only after deals have been struck that the investment greatly benefited China's military. Also, for example, Sri Lanka was forced to hand over control of its largest port when it could not pay off its bills to China. Yeah, while all of this helps China's Belt and Road Initiative, it also gives the Chinese Navy vital access to important waterways and thus more control over global supply chains. Yeah, speaking about ports, Chinese companies have purchased ports in Belgium, Spain, Italy, and Greece, highlighting Beijing's growing interest in Europe. And you might have even followed the recent debate about China wanting to invest in a container terminal of a port in Hamburg, Germany. Despite criticism, China was allowed to purchase almost 25% of the port. The German Foreign Ministry, however, warned that this would enable China to politically instrumentalize part of Germany's and Europe's critical infrastructure, which could again compromise supply chains. Also in the Western Balkans, Chinese invested 32 billion in the last 10 years. By doing that, China strengthens its presence in Europe's backyard. And even though the EU remains the main investor in the Balkans, China's investment is also attractive as Chinese money is not attached to any political, environmental, or social conditions. Yeah, China also invests in Latin America and Africa. I won't go in further detail here as I don't have the time, but in Africa, China is the major builder of infrastructure and extractor of natural resources. A nice example underlining how China combines investment with espionage is the following. Beijing financed and built the new African Union's headquarters in Ethiopia in 2012. And surprisingly, after some time, they discovered that the building's computer servers sent sensitive data to Shanghai every night, and that hidden microphones had been installed in the buildings. Yeah, the Arctic. We've heard yesterday about Russia's involvement in the Arctic. Most recently, also China shows ambitions to become a polar great power, meaning that it wants to increase its activity and investment in the Arctic. In 2018, China identified itself as a near Arctic state, despite being no closer to the Arctic than Poland is. China sees the Arctic as an ungoverned space, as a zone of future military competition, and as the world's new strategic frontier. The Polar Research Institute for China, for example, called the Arctic and other ungoverned spaces like the seabed or the space the most competitive resource treasures. Top officials of the Chinese Communist Party have suggested that China's shares of these resources found in the Arctic, for example, should be equal to its share of the global population. Yeah, my last example here is North Korea. I'm not sure if we can say this is connected with strategic investment, but it's another example of how China undermines the international system. North Korea's greatest supporter is China, and the cross-border trade between China and North Korea is a direct lifeline for North Korea. China has not done anything to shut this down. And not to solve problems, but to aggravate them is, of course, another way of undermining international order and stability. Yeah, to conclude, China uses a mix of espionage, theft, subordination, and strategic investments to further its geopolitical interests. Instead of building bonds of trust with its neighbors and major partners, China bullies and steals from them while claiming that it is innocent and is a victim too. We see that China's increasingly aggressive foreign policy is an attempt to force the West to capitulate to China's political agenda, and at the same time, its aggressiveness reveals a deep insecurity. Professor Schütt would probably call this fear. Yeah. How well the world deals with these new China rules and the Chinese behavior may in part determine the global balance of power over the next generation. Yeah, thank you very much for your attention. I'm very sorry not to be here physically today to answer your questions, but please feel free to ask my colleagues in case of any uncertainty or come to me in our next session.